Welcome to video 3. We are now in week 6 for development economics, and we continue our discussion looking at inequality and poverty with a focus on Rebillion's work. So basically, Rebillion's views on inequality and poverty echoes what was discussed in the last few minutes of video clip number 2. Redistribution does believe that the distribution of income is important because economic growth reduces absolute poverty to the degree depending on how equitable the distribution of income in that society is. And that's taken from Gowdy and Ladd. So in a nutshell, what Redistribution is saying is that redistribution enhances the poverty-reducing impact of economic growth. And there is empirical evidence behind this view. Okay, so what are we going to look at in this table is the change in poverty rates over 117 episodes of either economic growth or contraction from 1981 to 1999. And this is work by Redistribution. So he wanted to look at how inequality, or the trend in inequality, either whether it increases or decreases, how that impacts on changes in household income and through that poverty rates. Okay, so bear with me. You want to compare how ultimately poverty has changed under periods of or in context of either trends in increasing inequality or trends in decreasing inequality. And what you can see here, if you specifically zoom in on changes in household income and how that influenced poverty when the context was within a trend of increasing inequality, as we expect when household income decreases, there was an increase in poverty, and likewise when household income increased, there was a decrease in poverty. But also he talks about how often that occurred, 30% of the time when income increased and 16% of the time when income decreased. But now compare these averages of a year, the averages of what happened with poverty in these contexts over here when there was a decreasing trend in inequality. So again, as we expect, when your household income decreases, you expect poverty to increase. But look at the average here. It's 1.7% per annum as opposed to 14.3% increase per annum. And it occurred over 26% of spells as opposed to 16%. So yes, the impact of a decrease in annual percentage change in income was an increase in poverty, but it was far less. The impact was far less when you looked at contexts where the trend was decreased inequality as opposed to increasing inequality. Let's look at what happened when there was a percentage change that increased your household incomes, and as expected again, poverty was reduced under those conditions, but by a far higher average per annum in a context of decreasing inequality than increasing inequality. Here it was 9.6% per annum, the reduction in poverty, compared to only 1.3% reduction in poverty when you looked at contexts where inequality was increasing. And the percentage of spells are roughly the same. So clearly, based on this empirical evidence, countries in which the context was of decreasing trends in inequality, that had a preferable impact, and greatly so, on poverty reductions or poverty increases depending on how household incomes changed, i.e. depending on whether it was economic growth or contraction. And it was far favorable in cases with trends of decreasing inequality. Yes, when the economies contracted here, poverty did increase, but at a far lower average rate than above. And over here, when the economies were in a boom, poverty decreased at a much faster average rate compared to contexts where income inequality was increasing. So wrap your heads around that. And Revillion expresses himself so well, we are going to quote him here verbatim about why he thinks inequality matters. Economic reforms in developing countries can create opportunities for poor people, but only if conditions are in place for them to take advantage of these opportunities. Then only will absolute poverty fall, and fall rapidly. Given initial inequalities in income, as well as non-income dimensions of welfare, economic reforms can readily or easily bypass the poor. The conditions for pro-poor growth are this closely tied to reduce, that should be thus, not this, are thus closely tied to reducing the disparities in access to both human and physical capital, and sometimes also to differences in returns to assets that create income inequality and probably also inhibit overall growth prospects. So clearly, Revillion differs completely from Fields. Fields believes that poverty reduction should be the main priority. He doesn't really care much about inequality. If you look at how he ordered his priority list, Revillions say absolutely not. There is no way we can reduce poverty at the optimal rate if we don't consider inequality as well. So let's bring it back to South Africa once more. I'm sure you've all seen a similar figure in your macroeconomics where you try and understand economic growth in South Africa from the 1950s to more recent years, and you can look at that in your own time, and you can see it's rather mixed. Right now, you know, we are in a recession because of COVID. Let's look at income inequality. And this graph only looks at it about from 1993, which was just before the advent of democracy, to about 2008. And what do you see? Extremely high Gini coefficient. It's almost 0.7. It hasn't really changed over time at all. And this is despite fluctuations in economic growth over the same period. Something about Gini coefficients that you need to remember is that it is very sticky. It's what we call sticky. It's rather hard to change over short periods of time. If you look at one of our FGT measures, just look at poverty, headcount poverty rates at the 388 Rand poverty line over the same period, 1993 to 2008. You can see that poverty has reduced slightly over time using that 388 Rand poverty line, but something you will know from our lectures from last week is that it could look very different depending on which poverty line you use. This graph could look very, very different. So some thoughts on Revillion's argument. What he is saying in terms of the relationship between inequality and poverty seems to be very appropriate and relevant to the South African case, where we have extreme income inequality, and this may well have dampened or hampered poverty reduction by limiting economic growth and the effects of growth on poverty. So even during those boom years where we were growing, not much of that was being used to reduce poverty and to elevate those who were close to poverty into better positions. The implication has been that economic growth, poverty reduction, and pro-poor redistribution should rather be approached in a comprehensive or holistic way. But of course, growth is still imperative. It cannot be ignored or underplayed, especially now. But at the same time, we acknowledge that we need more than growth. How is that growth redistributed? What are we investing in human capital, and how are underlying structural issues being addressed in South Africa? So another clear priority for us is that we need to ensure efficiency gains from our extensive fiscal redistribution, and we've also looked at this somewhat, that South Africa really uses its redistribution tools to its utmost. Where we lose efficiency are through things like corruption, etc. But by and large, a lot of our social spending is well targeted, and it's getting to the poorest of the poor. Of course, there's always room for improvement. In 2015, we had about a GNI per capita of 72,000 Rand approximately per person. So pro-poor redistribution is important, but at the same time it is constrained by this GNI. If you look at this slide here at our fiscal redistribution, this clearly shows you that South Africa's redistribution, it is pro-poor. If you look at the top 10% of those within the market income, ranked by household market income, the top 10%, that's where 72% of South Africa's taxes is derived from, and 6% is the value in terms of what this top 10% gets back from government in terms of social spending. I want to compare that to the bottom 50%, who contribute 4% to South Africa's total taxes, and this will probably be through value-added tax, because even the poorest of the poor pay VAT. They don't live only on zero-rated goods, as some people think. Yet the bottom 50%, what they get back in terms of government social spending is about 60%. You can look at the middle 40%. So they are taxed, they contribute 25% towards taxes, and they get about 35%. So they are getting more than they are giving, and the case can be made that at the bottom end, they're getting far more than they are giving. So this is very redistributive at the top and the bottom end. So we are doing well in terms of how we target our taxing, and our tax system is progressive. So we tax those more who earn more, and our social spending is well targeted. It's getting to the poorest of the poor. It shouldn't be going to this top 10%. And it's good to see that what they get back is far less than what they give. Of course, there are consequences to both. So let's look now at the concept of inclusive growth. Okay, so inclusive growth is growth that is going to reduce both poverty and inequality. And the goal is that this type of growth must be sustainable, and that it will deliver a significant and sustainable reduction in poverty and inequality. So we all know that the earlier thoughts of trade-offs and trickle-down views were not holding, and alternatives to these views are what you probably have heard about, things like concepts like broad-based growth, shared growth, or pro-poor growth. The latest term that we bandy about is inclusive growth. And I'll stop right here because I'm running out of time on this Screenomatic. I'll see you in video clip number 4.